Now available on Indiegogo is my latest documentary, Here Comes a New Challenger, celebrating the legacy of the most influential fighting game ever made, Street Fighter II. The film will explore its development, its cultural impact, its updates with the likes of Champion Edition and Hyper Fighting, the merchandise, the home console releases, the live action movie and more. We are currently in post-production and still have even more interviews to film. If you want to get involved, like having your name in the credits, and get yourself a physical copy of the documentary, then follow the link below. Hello everyone, it's Oliver here. For this commentary, I'm joined by Audi Sorlie, who is a gaming historian, collaborates on DF Retro for the Digital Foundry YouTube channel, plus is helping me out behind the scenes on my documentary, Here Comes a New Challenger. Today, Audi and I are discussing Street Fighter II, the animated movie. How are you doing, Audi?
Very good, very good. And I'm so happy to be here to talk to you about this film, because this is a very important film to video games, it's a very important film to Street Fighter, and most importantly, it's a very important movie to me.
Same as well. I mean, it was after watching the live action film, which kind of left some of us disappointed. Maybe some love it because of its kind of slight sort of mistakes here and there. But the animated movie was kind of this kind of blessing in disguise, I think, for many of us who only read about it in the magazines, and then finally it came out and it was like the best thing ever. When I was 15 anyway.
I love the live action film as it's being documented on a certain Blu-ray. Actually, I kind of mirror them, because there are things that this animated film does well that the live action doesn't do too well. But there's also issues I have with the animated film that I think the live action handles better.
Oh, interesting. Okay, it's going to be interesting to hear your thoughts on that as we progress through the film. Okay, folks, if you wish to sync this commentary with your own copy of the film, just a heads up, this is the uncut version, so it has all the swearing and nudity put back in. So put the timestamp to 0 and press play now. So this was what, for me, came out on VHS October, I believe, of 95. So the movie live action film had come out in the summer of that year in May.
Yeah.
And I read about this animated movie through the gaming magazines, Nintendo Magazine System, Superplay.
Yeah, Superplay was the big one for me.
Yeah, so most of all this sort of the multi-format magazines were also mentioning it, saying, because I think a lot of them had reviewed the Japanese version, was saying this was like amazing. So once it came out on VHS, I had no real expectations for it because I didn't see a trailer. You know, it was just like, it's out on VHS, and that was it. And I was really blown away by it because it was kind of really tapped into the sort of the core characters of Street Fighter.
Well, for me, I consider this kind of the second wave of manga entertainment's introduction of anime, because that started with like Akira and Vampire Hunter D and Dominion Tank Police and all these fantastic animations, which I'd grown up with. And then this came out. I think it was kind of late for us in Europe. It was like 95. And like you, I had read about it, and I was just like blown away with the screenshots that I was seeing. The fact that like this looked like Street Fighter, which the live action film, you could probably argue doesn't look like Street Fighter. But this film had been in production for quite some time, and the Japanese audiences were very familiar with it by the time we even first learned of it.
Yes, true. Yeah, because they deployed the poster of the movie, for the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive release of Super Street Fighter 2. So they're already kind of getting the fan base to sort of be aware of this kind of anime through just artwork design of the video game. So
not only that, but the movie officially was announced at I forget the name of that tournament, but I think it was early 93, summer 93. After the tournament was done in Japan, they actually announced the film and showed the storyboard sketches and I think even animatics of the storyboard to show that this was coming. And this was shown on the tournament wasn't shown on television, but the actual announcement was shown on TV Tokyo. So this was a feature film. I liken this film to basically be the video game Disney film, because video game adaptations in Japan had primarily been relegated to OVAs, which was original video animation, which basically were lower budgeted animations tied in with a release of a game. You had like Final Fantasy had some, Fatal Fury famously had a few, and we'll talk more about Fatal Fury because that has a lot to do with this film. But primarily lower budgeted films, straight to video on VHS. But this was fully feature film budget cast lineup. The voice actors in Japan, very famous, and so this was a huge deal.
Well, also with the design of the characters, we saw this kind of, as you were saying, sort of second wave of manga, but it's also this sort of second wave of Capcom sort of changing things up for the characters, because as we saw the influence of the animated movie fall onto Street Fighter Zero or Alpha. But what I love about this moment here is kind of it is like a little bit of a prequel. It's showing that sort of Street Fighter 1 battle with Ryu and Sagat giving him the scar, which was kind of really cool at the time. And this amazing landscape is kind of this, when you see the wind blowing all the grass and so forth, which they utilised in Alpha 2.
The dramatic battle.
Yeah, it was so influential to what would come after it.
Oh, this was hugely influential to Street Fighter. I mean, this sequence as well that we're seeing soon here with the Hadouken from Ryu. I mean, that was the introduction to Super Street Fighter 2, and then also subsequently Turbo, and with him doing the fireball here. So I mean, this whole scene became kind of part of the iconography of Street Fighter, and would even show up in Street Fighter EX. So even the spin-offs would take inspirations from this. But yeah, I mean, the actual design of the film and the layout of it would be hugely inspirational for Street Fighter. And Alpha was basically spearheaded from the success they were seeing from the production of the film, not just the release, but as it was being produced. That was kind of like, we can take Street Fighter in this direction with this kind of art style, with this kind of production.
Because Sagat was no longer tall and lean, he was just like
beefy,
mounted of muscle.
Bison as well.
Bison as well.
Yeah. Those designs are directly from here, because they were kind of tall and lanky, both of them. In all of the bosses except for Balrog, and we're using the English names for this English commentary, but because famously Bison and Vega are switched in Japan. So, but yeah, here's also the introduction of new characters, and that was something we'll talk more about the production as we go along. But here you can see who is revealed now to be Cammy, and she was part of the new challengers from Super Street Fighter 2, and that was in production as this movie was entering production, because this movie entered production in early '93, secured by a guy called Imai Kenichi, if I remember correctly, his kanji. And he secured the film, tried to write it also, but basically these characters weren't actively part of Street Fighter, but they were sketched up. And that caused some issues, from what I've read, is that some of these scenes had to kind of be inserted later, because these characters had to show up.
This is a mandate from Capcom, which they sort of, do you think they sort of forced upon Stephen E. D'Souza for his version? Had to include all the characters,
It's the same story basically, right? That like all the characters have to show up, and that's one of my issues that we were talking about in the introduction. Is that I think the live action film, it manages to find a place for most of the characters, whether or not it's kind of artificial to their original origin. I think that at least in the terms of the story and the setting, the characters fit in that little space we get in the live action. Whereas I think in this film, we have a lot of very artificial just drop in. They just literally step into a scene, say hello, and then we never see them again. And we don't really get anything out of them showing up. Cammy here has somewhat of a influence on the story, but she also kind of disappears out of the film. DJ, T-Hawk, most of the new challengers actually kind of show up and
they
don't really have much to do. And I think the live action then was, credit to D'Souza who figured that out. But I think that's one of the main parts where I would say that when I look at this, I think the live action handled just the amount of characters better than this animation does.
Well, also like Zangief and Blanca also get kind of somewhat shortchanged, in terms of their.
Yeah, they're just part of like a entertainment show, right? Which
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's
They benefit though. They do get to show off their sort of they don't. We get to see them do their special moves.
well, every character has to do one of their special moves, which is another mandate where everyone does. And here we have the introduction of Guile, and oh man, talk about getting shortchanged in this film, because we never really get to see Guile do anything until the very end when he gets beaten up. Spoiler alert. But I was always curious why this was, and I actually met some of the people who worked on the film when I was working in Japan, and I actually have somewhat of an answer to this. And that was due to the fact that as this was entering later production, and from scripting end, first of all, Guile was a much more popular character in the US market. Japanese gamers weren't using. He was one of the least played characters, which was something that they actually referenced in terms of who gets screen time. And there was
very surprising, isn't it? Because Guile was, I suppose because he's been an American character, but I think a lot of people used him in the early days of Street Fighter 2 because he could do the sort of dizzy combos. And
sure, I mean,
a bit overpowered.
It wasn't that he wasn't being used, but just lesser than the other characters. Because other charged characters in the game probably were more popular at the point that this was going into production. And there was also a sense from Capcom, because Capcom was very involved with this and the live action. And the live action would primarily take, perspective from Guile, and he was the main character. So it was kind of like, well, Guile has the American film, and this Japanese film is focusing on the Japanese characters, the popular Japanese characters, I should say. So that's one of the reasons why. And the other is also, I just think, familiarity. Just he's an American general or captain, I guess they say in the film. So it's just kind of like, what do we do with him? Well, not much, apparently. Not much at all.
He does get to let go with a sort of epic sonic boom.
He does.
And a sort of a weird angle where they sort of animated him to do a flash kick because it's from behind.
Yes,
you don't really see
it's
it.
very strange. And there were subsequent animations from other teams where, again, Guile doesn't really get to show off much. So it's a recurring thing.
Yeah.
And I guess this isn't a PG movie, so I can say that. I guess it's like a Guile blue balls, right? We can't get over that. But Guile does not get a lot of screen time.
The animated movie has the sort of the novelty and obviously the opportunity to have all these characters in their outfits, because the live action film, they have to sort of transform into them by the end, kind of like superheroes as they become these characters. So you can get away with just having Vega in his outfit, and you just come to accept it, and you get it's perfectly normal, and that's the beauty of animation. You don't have to sort of worry about. No one's wearing
shirts. I guess they're in Thailand, so I guess it's hot, but. I mean, you look at Bison as well, and Bison, had his outfit throughout the film. Raul Julia wore it pretty well. But here, he
did.
The change to him was made because the tallness of Sagat, was one thing, but Bison was kind of similarly built in the Street Fighter games, the original Street Fighter 2. So they gave him this much more menacing, beefy look, just to kind of, as Sagat is tall, Bison is wide, so there's kind of like because you can't have too many similar characters on screen, because if they all look the same, they feel the same, and you kind of forget them. But I mean, Bison's design is just magnificent and very inspired by other manga characters and animation characters that were out there at the time.
Everyone's so freakishly disproportioned, aren't they? So that's the great thing about anime. It's like
he's my height. So
obviously we just saw you've got the androids there to sort of go around, sort of spying on the Street Fighter characters to sort of evaluate their skill sets, and obviously that would be because also we saw an animated, like a video game based on this animated movie, only for
in Japan only,
the PlayStation and Saturn. Yeah, I think I remember reading in a PlayStation magazine. I think there was this talk of bringing it over to the West. I think Virgin Interactive were going to sort of give it a release, but it was eventually cancelled.
Yeah, it was.
Probably just down to the fact that it wasn't really a good game.
It's not good.
Weird.
So basically, how that game works is that you actually see it from the perspective of that android with that monocle eye. And you scan the actual animation fights that you see in this film and get like biographical content of the characters you're scanning, and then there's some fighting sequences based on Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. So, but they're not very good.
Yeah. No, but it does have some exclusive animation, though, doesn't it?
Very little, but it has some cut content. Yeah, that was put back in. I think this scene kind of brings up another topic we haven't touched on yet, but obviously there is an American dub and then there's a Japanese dub of this film. And this scene in the Japanese cut is very restricted, I'd say. It's very introspective, very quiet. But in the American dub, or there are 2 American dubs, I think. There's Manga Entertainment and then Animes, I think, did one. But for both, there is a new score. And man, we have to talk about that score.
Well, the score was incredible. It was it shifts the tone of the movie completely, because I was so used to this version, and then back in days of trying to get hold of the soundtrack, I didn't know that the US mix and all that music was never released. So when I got the Japanese album, it was just like completely different. Yes. It's kind of weird, kind of pop music, and it was such a like disappointment. And I know there's always anime fans who love the kind of the original intent of the audio, and they stick to it, which is great. It's wonderful. But in the case of Street Fighter, the Western kind of mixers and designers, whatever, they made such a huge leap in improving the sort of the audio and the music, and it was a time I really got to hear the likes of Korn, because at the time Korn, their album hadn't been released in the UK. I think it was only on import, and so it was like, wow, what is this? And then, but also on the flip side of that, you've got the new orchestral music, all sort of synthesized kind of stuff, which is adds an extra layer of sort of mythology to Ryu and their history, and it just gave it such a punch, with every scene. So I was gutted it never got released.
Yeah, because the Japanese soundtrack and the Japanese film, the dialogue as well, because it was localized quite heavily. It's much more of a spiritual tale, which is done introspectively for Ryu. He doesn't say much, and the movie doesn't really say much. It's letting the audience just kind of like wonder what's going through his mind and make assumptions. And I think for the Western audiences, this was kind of like, well, this is way too philosophical of a direction for an animated feature. So they got Corey Lerios and John DeAndrea to do that soundtrack for the US print. And they had previously worked on like Baywatch and my favorite show, Thunder in Paradise, of which it shares some thematical styles for music. But then also, as you mentioned, this was a feature film in all intents and purposes. I don't know if it played theatrically in the US, but in terms of just its presentation, it was. So they also licensed music via Sony Music for like Korn, Alice in Chains, and this was my introduction to kind of that kind of what's that genre called? Grunge? I don't know.
Yeah, grunge music. Yeah, because I had been listening to like Faith No More and stuff, so it's kind of an easy transition into this. But yeah, like things like Silverchair, as you say, is one like Korn. But it was that sort of phase of my teenage years, that sort of grumpy teenager sort of music, and I kind of just I adored it. But I sort of over the years, I still kind of like it, but I've evolved my musical tastes have changed quite radically since then. But it just gave the film an extra layer of edge, and it fit perfectly within the sort of the manga sort of entertainment what we got on tape.
Yeah. Remember like the promos and stuff for that? Like manga entertainment promos were all like rock music and whatnot.
Oh, it was incredible.
So,
yeah.
It was very stylistic, and we were at that age. We were becoming teenagers. I'd moved from Guns N' Roses basically over to Alice in Chains, and then here they are in the film. So,
yeah. We've got Fei Long here, haven't we? So now the voice. Now people have said it's actually Bryan Cranston, isn't it?
Yes.
It sounds like him.
isn't it?
But if it's under a pseudo name, something like that.
I'm pretty sure it is Bryan Cranston.
Yeah. I don't think he's credited though. I think it's a different name he's used.
No, he had a different name back then, but he did a lot of anime and animation voiceovers in general. I mean, for those who don't know, Bryan Cranston is famous for now for like Breaking Bad, and I think he was in Malcolm in the Middle as well. Basically, one of the biggest television stars today, as we record this in 2021. But as this voice is, famous in the U.S. print and the Japanese print, he's actually voiced by a man called Ishii Kazuyoshi. And Ishii Kazuyoshi is very important to this film because he was actually one of the choreographers of the film, the fight choreographer, and would become the founder of K1. If he hadn't founded it while production was going on, he would found K1, and he was a very controversial figure and is in Japan. But here they give him the voice of Fei Long, which to me is kind of funny because Fei Long is basically Bruce Lee in every way, and then they give Ishii the voice of Fei Long to kind of signal that, hey, this is the real Bruce Lee, which kind of fits in with his public image in Japan.
The fight scenes, I mean, this is where we see the sort of rotoscoping, kind of like they're recording the footage and then going over it. So we got such fluid animation,
And that was so important. Yeah, I think that's why the movie survives as well as it does, because the story is paper thin, let's be honest. The story is kind of mangled together through way too many characters and way too many segments. But the fighting is so grounded in realism that every impact that we see, you'll notice that most of the things we see on screen, they are not maybe moves from the game, but they're moves from real life that as they impact hurt, and it looks like it hurts because it did probably in real life as they were filming this. And that I think was so important, that if you just fill the movie up with Hadokens and sonic booms and all this kind of flashy stuff, we wouldn't be able to connect with the characters and the film the same way we do. But because they fight very much like real life fighters would, our brains make that connection that like this is real, this is actually, this hurts. And that's why I think we all remember this movie so well, is that it kind of hurts watching it in that right way. It hurts because the punches and the kicks, they do connect, and if you didn't do it that way, it wouldn't have been as memorable.
I think this really helps with sort of bringing, in particular, kind of Ryu to life, because you only see him move in a certain way in the video game, and when you do play the video game, everyone just spams with special moves. So when you see Ryu kind of blocking and doing these different counterattacks, it's somewhat, actually, when you come to see sort of Street Fighter 3 and its animation, it seems to be how Ryu's he's moving more like the anime in that game.
Well, you saw even there, you saw two moves that are from the game, but the way they did them is very different, right? Because Fei Long's kick, in the game does produce fire, and you catch fire if you get hit by it. But in this film, they put the fire as a transitional method. It's not necessarily his legs, it's the scene transition that is the fire. So it's just kind of cinematic language. And then when you see Ryu do the Tatsumaki, the hurricane kick, it's not in the game, he's standing straight up with his leg out. It looks kind of, if you've seen City Hunter with Jackie Chan, you'll know how silly it looks in real life. But in this film, they changed it. So they looked at the move and said, okay, what is he doing? Well, he's spinning around 360 degrees with a kick. So they actually give him 3 kicks where he uses the weight of his leg. It's a taekwondo technique where he basically just spins around with the actual momentum of his kicks. And then, it adds realism. It kind of works. Of course, he's in the air for way too long. But we can still connect realism to the move. And it's actually so cool that in EX, that was made into the Tatsumaki. So he uses the technique you see in the film. That's right,
yeah. I mean, you see, Scott Adkins can do something somewhat similar to that in some of his films.
Today, I'm sure there are, like martial arts today, the people who grew up with this game are just incredible, right? So they probably mastered the real Tatsumaki. But I mean, when I was doing the martial arts at this time, I was doing kickboxing because I wanted to be Van Damme, and I could not do it. But
I was doing Taekwondo.
Okay, so you could have maybe done it, but no, I could do the splits and I could do the helicopter kick. to a certain extent.
Oh, nice.
So I can still do the splits.
I could do the
if
splits.
I try.
No,
I just can't get up again. And here we see another scene that is just kind of tacked on.
Yeah, another tacked on scene where it's a shame because T-Hawk. I suppose T-Hawk was never one I sort of gravitated towards when I was playing the game. I always find him quite a frustrating character to play against when playing the AI. But we do get to see Ken do a sort of dragon punch, but it's not quite as in the video game. He has the best dragon punch, but in the anime it doesn't really. It's kind of like it's a weak dragon punch he pulls off just to get rid of him.
Yeah, and I mean I think these scenes, from what I recall reading the Japanese production notes, this was actually animated last. Like, this was way into production, and it was just kind of like, well, what do we do here? And I'm curious to what's been cut out of the film. I'm not sure if any of the recent releases have any cutscenes, but
No.
in order for it to be theatrical length, they must have taken something else out, and there must have been something related to Ken.
I think there was something related to Chun Li, which does do a fireball, but I don't.
Yes, that's a very popular cut scene. I don't think that was ever finished animated though. I think that was
No.
and that was
I think it was just mentioned. I read.
yeah, it was just storyboarded, but there was the feeling that there had already been one fireball. The Hadokens are very seldomly shown in the film because they are supposed to be kind of the finishers. So I think it would have been. It was just kind of seen as if she has a fireball as well, then what's so special about it? You can even see here Ken is about to do it. They tease it, but they leave it to the end. We saw it at the beginning, but we didn't see it. We saw him. You saw you charge it and throw it towards the camera, but we didn't see the effects of it. So
I do like how they do that in this, how they've designed it, because it's very sort of like Big Trouble in Little China.
Yes, very much
bolts
so.
of lightning come from somewhere, which I love.
Oh yeah,
Love that. I just love that sort of rotoscoped animation, of lightning.
Yeah. So, but yeah, T-Hawk here is in and out of the film, and really doesn't, even for T-Hawk, I don't think he really. I mean, he gives Ken some sort of, I guess, levity a bit to his purpose in the film.
I suppose it's their way to sort of show that there's always some street fighting happening.
Yeah.
So it's this. The idea of a tournament is kind of just pushed aside. It's just like there's pockets of fighting kicking off around the globe.
Yeah, because this does globetrot, this film, and that's another thing where I don't think we ever get to kind of settle in the movie. As an audience, I think we jump around a little bit too much. I think the movie should have centralized somewhere, maybe 5 to 10 minutes earlier, and then kind of plant our feet down, because here we just jump around so much, which is true to the game, but a game doesn't necessarily work cinematically. There's 2 different languages happening here, and how much time is passing even between these events, and these kind of things we aren't really notified of, especially time. There's, by the way, Akuma sitting to the left there.
Oh yeah.
This is a little cameo.
I remember seeing that when I was younger. I was like, oh my god, because I was just playing it on the 3DO. Just like that was my sort of like quick. I know that character. My friends were like, "Who's that?"
And that was actually also a late edition. He was originally not. He was not designed up by the time this went into production, I believe. So that's.
Well, he's not even animated, is he?
No, he
like
just sits down. So
image,
he's literally just tacked on. So.
He's selling fruit as well. So.
I guess, is he selling it or is he eating it? I don't know.
I don't know.
Would you buy fruit from Akuma? I guess it depends on the prices.
Now, obviously, because the you mentioned the sort of globe trotting, and that sort of fits with the idea that you go in different countries in the game to fight these characters. But weirdly, the anime doesn't really utilize any of the sort of the stage designs from the game in the film. Now we've got locations like Guile's kind of the US airbase, but we don't really see much in terms of the visual elements from the game.
No, the stages.
Where the movie tries to throw in little elements here and there.
Oh yeah, you got like the bell.
Yeah, and Sagat's kind of statue in the background of his club. That sort of that woman lying down, for his stage. But there's kind of small elements,
Yeah, and there are in this film there are like Buddha statues and stuff in this film as well. So there are nods, and the locations themselves, I suppose, is nods, but you don't get that straight up. I mean, when Ken was fighting, he was on the docks, but he was inside a hangar at night. So it's just kind of like it's the complete opposite of kind of what you see in the game. Again, I think that is kind of creative choice to make sure that the movie works on its own and not always rely on, oh, I remember that from the game. Oh, I remember that too. Because that takes you out of the film.
Yeah, you can look at it like that. I mean, it's playing it out a little bit more subtle with its design.
Yeah. Because, or else you are literally just sitting there and like, where's Waldowing the entire film? You're just like, oh, that's there. Okay, that's there. Oh, yeah, that's from the game. And this becomes distracting to that audience. For the general audience, it can also be a bit distracting because, the significance of those locations wouldn't translate to people watching this that have never played the game. And that was a pretty big thing here, was to introduce Street Fighter 2 and mainstream audience, because theatrical films goes way beyond a video game audience, especially circa 93, 94.
Oh yeah, you have to appeal to the mainstream who are somewhat unfamiliar,
And here again, you see the fighting here, and I mean this is a little bit more comedic, but you see some elements of supernatural things here with Dalsum, but also the effect, it slows it down and does this screen morph transitioning. So you don't really get, is he actually doing it, or is it just, an effect that we're seeing, or is he like teleporting, flying? It keeps it grounded enough that like you don't completely leave the movie, and he doesn't really stretch. That's another thing. He does not really stretch in this film. He just does all these psychological things rather than.
There's a couple of little stretchy moments he does. I think just tries to attack from a distance, but it's not like they don't go too far with it. No.
Not to the extent of not the rubber. He's not Plastic Man, like.
No. But Honda, which is great about this version. Or maybe I think it's probably the same in the Japanese version, that Honda is played for comedy.
Yeah, which.
And I like that sort of element because thankfully he doesn't get pushed aside, because Dalsim unfortunately does now.
Yeah.
As we sort of move on with the story, but Honda does come back and sort of gets to fight Balrog,
And does well. I mean, he holds his own, so he's comedic, but at the same time, I mean, look at the abs on that man. I've never seen a sumo wrestler with those kinds of abs, so I guess all the credit to him. He's keeping in shape.
He's got a fat six pack,
which he also does have in the games. So, but I mean the uses of the central cast is pretty spot on from the games. It's just especially with the new challenges as mentioned, those characters don't come through, and I'd also say some of the other cast from the game, like you mentioned Sagiv and Blanca, but they get to do their moves at least. But
well, it's a problem, isn't it? Because once you have too many characters, it becomes a difficult juggling act. Yeah, and you can't focus. And thankfully, Ryu and Ken are integral to the story, and I think that's what for the fans of the game. That's always been those characters. I think something you'd addressed when you had done your commentary to the live action film was that there was the mythology of the characters weren't fully like ingrained in pop culture or like fully refined.
No,
so
not at all.
D'Souza could be flexible with these characters because all you really knew about them was like the instruction manual, and it would just say who they were, their likes and dislikes, and their height, blood type, which is weird.
It makes sense in Japan because they have a lot of like character traits tied to blood types. That's why that's in there. But yeah. Right, okay. So, but yeah, in this film, this movie establishes a lot of the characteristics beyond their fighting that is seen later in the games. So that's one thing that, being a Japanese production staff, they probably had much more involvement with Capcom, being like, hey, who is this character compared to the one we see in the game? What goes deeper than his fighting style, and then they could kind of make that up on the fly. So I always found this scene, by what we're seeing here, the action scene here, kind of interesting because they give a lot of screen time to a couple characters that aren't from the game. They aren't introduced in the film. You saw the guy with the scar on his nose, and then the other red-haired man.
Well, yeah, because I was about to say to you, is there any sort of fan theories on who that could be?
Yeah, there is, and some people claim it's actually the characters from Ikari Warriors from SNK, who Clark and something, who are actually in King of Fighters, because they have some similarities apparently. And at this time, it could be true, but I think it's just a coincidence. But at this time, there was a lot of public fighting between SNK and Capcom and this movie was actually at the center of one of their biggest, because this movie was announced in '93, and SNK had already announced and shown off Fatal Fury, the motion picture, because they were moving from the OVAs to an actual motion picture. And there was a race to the cinemas. One cinema, by the way. Both of the movies were only shown in one single theater, I think, in Tokyo. But SNK were very much on the race here to get their movie out. And I believe they won. I think Fatal Fury, the motion picture, came out in Japan 2 weeks before this. Like, it was literally at the goal line that these released next to each other. So,
I mean, in terms of quality, though, I mean, because the Fatal Fury, you're referring to the sort of the animated feature length.
The motion picture.
I'd never seen that. So, I mean, do you find that sort of lesser quality compared to this?
Oh, they're so different, and so it kind of goes into the production of these films. But Fatal Fury, the motion picture, they are continuations of OVAs. There were 2 OVAs in Japan based on Fatal Fury. And they were all handled by Audi, who at the time was probably the most hot creator in the industry in Japan. Audi was just incredible, and still is a living legend. And his production designs and direction was very, for lack of better terms, sexy. And I don't mean just by the attractiveness of a character. I mean the way he shot fights, the way he made just action happen. It's stylistic and sexy, whereas this movie, its production was very uneven in the beginning, and went for kind of the opposite. We talked about grounding, right? And the fights in this movie are very grounded. The character designs are very detailed, and aren't really played up for anything but their power. All of these designs are based on their power rather than their attractiveness. Even Chun Li. So, they're so different films, and I think they both do what they want to do very well, because the fighting in Fatal Fury, the motion picture, is very stylized and has a lot of the projectile fights and moves, and all that stuff. So it's more similar to the game maybe, but at the same time it feels much more like a cartoon, whereas this feels like a film.
Yeah, sounds to me like more ambitions to sort of be taken a little bit more seriously.
Because Capcom at this time were trying to become a media conglomerate, and this movie was central. And I talked about this on the live action commentary for 88 Films as well. Is that Capcom was going into every avenue. They were going from video games to music, theater, like live stage theater, and all these live action films, animation films. They were trying to become basically Disney. That's a close comparison I could think of, and maybe it didn't really work out for them because they lost a lot of money.
They had tried to license, I think they had licensed out, but it wasn't very good, like a 3D ride. Because I think there's one based on RoboCop as well, where RoboCop's on a jetpack like a motorbike, sort of flying around this kind of 3D world, looking a bit like Lawnmower Man.
Yeah.
But there was a Street Fighter one, and the Street Fighter one is awful.
Yes.
But it's like they were clearly just throwing out loads of ideas and giving out licenses to all these companies to sort of expand upon their sort of this kind of this multimedia kind of company that is just not just fixated on video games, but all forms of entertainment.
Yeah, and this was kind of a thing in Japan, especially then. It's less so now, because now we just deal with acquisitions all the time. But back then, the success of a game globally could kind of mark the transitioning into a conglomerate. And Capcom was probably, if any company, maybe Konami as well, but Capcom was really positioned to become the biggest game publisher and developer in the world at the time of Street Fighter. And so it makes total sense that they would want to try to do this. But it didn't work out for them for several other reasons than this film. And even the live action. The live action was hugely successful from box office numbers. So these two films could have, led to that. But it was all the other businesses in domestically in Japan that kind of became Capcom's undoing of growing that large.
I know I think they had lost money on the sort of Super Street Fighter 2. I think in terms of I think they were expecting to sell more of the CPS2 hardware, and they didn't.
Yes.
And obviously, come CPS3, they sold far less. So there was this. Obviously, they paid for the live action movie out of their own pocket. So, but that was all. The revenue earned from their huge sales of the of Street Fighter 2 and the arcade and Super Nintendo. But you're saying that. So, what was their sort of major loss then? You think in Japan?
Well, it was there was also real estate involved, and there was all these different avenues, and there was Street Fighter in a sense didn't get a sequel fast enough. It got upgrades and it got 0, but the number 3 was very powerful, and by the time 3 came out, it was unfortunately too late. I mean, Namco had come in with Tekken. Toshinden to a certain extent had actually taken some popularity away from Street Fighter by going 3D so early, and then Street Fighter EX wasn't the 3D game people were expecting because it's not by Capcom, it's by Arika. I love EX though, but it just there was all these decisions based around Street Fighter and also some of their other games that didn't make sense from a consumer standpoint. They were waiting on 3. They didn't get it, and it took too long. Because when 3 came out, it's an amazing game, but by the time it came out, it didn't have the impact of Street Fighter 2. I mean, that's clear to see based even on your documentary is based on Street Fighter 2, because Street Fighter 3 just didn't have that global impact.
No, it didn't. I mean, the first images I saw of it was in CVG, and I was like wowed by the sort of look
Same.
of it. But it was when she saw
next to like Tekken 3.
yeah, exactly. And but it was once you sort of started to play it, the animation blew you away, but it was the character lineup just didn't appeal, and it didn't really grab you. And there was less characters to choose from, and the music was different. And I understood the sort of creative decision to change things, but it was such a big leap. And they finally learnt their lesson come Third Strike to bring back some of the key characters to sort of get people back into the game. But obviously, another scene here we've got with another super character, DJ, which is I like DJ in this. He's quite funny. I like that he sort of plays on the sort of he swears a few times.
Yes. In one of the dubs.
Yeah, that's right. Badass motherfuckers. But yeah, he does. Shortly get shortchanged. But the weird thing is, even though when Super Street Fighter 2 came out and they introduced these 4 new characters, strangely, and some, I think Capcom were maybe somewhat surprised or happy at the time that they were kind of integrated quite quickly into the lineup. They didn't feel out of place.
No, in the games themselves, I think they fit in perfectly. I mean, the designs were not too abstract, and I think they came close enough to the original release that people were still being introduced to Street Fighter. So there wasn't that kind of disconnect where it's like years later you have like the son of Guile or something like this come up. It was very much in the time space of people still picking up a Super Nintendo, buying the latest Street Fighter. There's the characters that are in it, and so I think they came at a time where it was just at the cusp of being too late. But for example, Cammy I think is such a strong character design that people really fell in love with that character. And Fei Long I guess was the least popular. Maybe DJ was the least popular from what I understand, but they still survived. They showed up in Street Fighter 4 and things like this. So yeah, they're very much part of the Street Fighter lore, except in this movie where they really don't mean much at all. Like DJ here just gets his walk-on scene.
I do love these sort of cyborgs and their really sort of somewhat peculiar decisions to sort of dress up as a fireman.
Yes.
And no one notices these guys with half a sort of robot face, just wearing like a cap and a sort of baseball
I guess
hoodie.
In this world, I'm not really sure because the movie doesn't really show off what state the world is in. but I guess maybe there are some robotics and stuff. Maybe it's not that far off because we don't really see it.
It should have started in the future of 19XX,
right? Like Mega Man.
Something. Yeah. So 1999 then, but yeah.
There you see Chun Li's father is deaf. I guess I think this was the first time you actually saw the actual event of that.
What he looked like.
So
yeah.
And again, it goes back to like showing the origins of these characters and the moments that made them. So because earlier we saw Ryu and Ken training, and those designs would go on to influence the Zero designs. Like Ken has that super long ponytail, and Ryu doesn't have the white headband yet, but he gets the red headband from Ken. That's what he used to make his ponytail. So now we know where that came from. And another just walk on here is the fight here between Blanca and Sagiv coming up, which I guess for those two characters, Blanca, it's the same issue kind of you have with the live action, that Blanca is just so out there. He's the weirdest character that you can't really explain. His explanation in the game even is just kind of like a plane crash over Brazil because of some chemicals, he turned green and he became feral, and it's like none of this really, one thing doesn't connect to the other.
Doesn't he say his mom had given him those things around his
bracelet on his leg, or anklet? I don't know.
Yeah,
ankle
what?
bracelet.
She imprisoned him or something?
No, people do that in real life. The friendship bands or whatever. I guess you just.
But when I read that as I was younger, I thought literally the sort of metal things around his ankles.
Fed fish heads in the basement. Yeah, I guess that's why he kind of escaped. But in the live action it's even harder to explain. But here, he's in a cage match basically with Sagiv, so you kind of buy the fact that he's just thrown in there with a wild animal. And it's a cool fighting scene, but you can't really do much with these characters. I think they're too. Even Sagiv is just so simplistic, and he's from a different era at this point. I mean, we're past the Cold War, and he's just kind of like a silly Russian wrestler of the Soviet Union, right? So it's just like, what do we do with him in this story? Like, make him a nationalist? That's not very interesting, is it?
Well, it plays into your, the idea of, I think, with the story was to focus on the core sort of popular Japanese characters, and obviously, Ken himself is obviously American, but he was still just, sort of the yin and yang to sort of Ryu, isn't he? Sort of the opposite. It's a fun fight. But it's weirdly that Blanca took on the design, didn't he, for Alpha 3? That kind of took on the animated look for him.
All of them.
It does look a little bit different.
Yeah, all the designs in Alpha or Zero takes on much more inspiration from this, because I think there was the sense that because Zero was the continuation, it just didn't have the 3 number, right? It went back in time. But I think there was very much the sense that this was a global film, very importantly, it was a globally successful film, and so this is kind of what people look at and think Street Fighter now as in circa 95, 94. This is basically what people imagine. So they had it was Bengus, who was the artist from Capcom, took much more inspiration from this than the original sketches from Street Fighter and such. That wouldn't really come back until Street Fighter 4.
Well, the director of this, I think he had replaced someone else, but he'd said that his kind of inspiration for the look of this animated movie was this Street Fighter 2 Turbo artwork where they had all the characters on with the backdrop of like this airbase, so Guile's stage, and I kind of found out that kind of somewhat recently, and I was like, oh yeah, because the artwork does somewhat kind of, the design of those characters do sort of translate quite well to this.
I actually have a lot. I know we're talking to not have awkward silence during this shower scene, but I actually have a lot to say about this, because this scene, I worked in Japan for quite a while, and when I go to, for example, like animation convention stuff in the West, there's always the topic of fan service in film and video games, and it's a very important topic to discuss because it can definitely become exploitative and can be there just simply for a small portion of the audience that react to that kind of stuff. And I remember I went to a panel a few years ago where someone had like bad fan service examples, and I was curious because some games I had worked on was actually on the panel, so I kind of wanted to be there and kind of learn from it, right? And someone brought this up as like, oh, this this is one of the most famous video game films, and look at what they did. And actually, from a cinematic language standpoint, this is how to do fan service right, because throughout the film and throughout the video games, we are told constantly that Chun-Li is equal to the men. She's an extremely competent fighter and really, can hold her own. So in a one-on-one fight, there's not much danger for her compared to, say, Guile, right? And throughout this film, we see her in her garb, ready to fight at all times. And we've seen examples of her kicking the android's head, actually holding her own against Guile. We've already seen her as a formidable opponent or as a fighter. In this scene, they actually strip her bare, literally, of all the things that we associate with her, so that we become aware of her being vulnerable. And as a character, she is at her most vulnerable because she is not, prepared. She's in her most intimate space, basically. And I know that you could say that, like, well, we can just see her in a silhouette showering. But as, again, cinematic language, because nudity isn't necessarily in itself bad. And by seeing her naked, as our brains, just psychologically, we do realize that she is at her most vulnerable because we've seen it. She is not prepared. So the entire scene makes sense of this because, of course, yeah, there's an element of fan service, and anything that has fandom, you're going to have fan service. You have to play to an audience regardless. And she's the most popular female character in video games, so naturally there is there is that angle that let's show her off. But they do it tastefully, and I mean, at the same time, they show her naked for like 2 seconds, and I mean, if that's all you need, I just hope you're happy in your marriage elsewhere. But the actual setup of the scene is brilliantly done.
The setup is really good.
Yeah,
it is. Yeah, how it sort of transitions through the city as it sort of dissolves as it gets closer and closer, and how it's scored as well.
Scored as well, because this is basically a Friday the 13th scene. She's vulnerable. She's in her shower, and we see the entire scene from the perspective of the murder.
Somewhat Hitchcock.
Yeah, somewhat Hitchcock.
Yeah. With a sort of, we see her like behind the blinds as she's walking around in her bedroom. The sort of rear window.
And we see her halfway preparing now. We see the famous hairdo come back. We're kind of like, okay, so she can, we know she's in danger, but we already have a little bit of sense that, she can survive this. But will she? Because it's the most dangerous of the murderers basically being sent for her with, a claw, an actual, like, murderous weapon. So, but as the scene goes on, I mean, they totally make up for any weakness she had because she throws the damn couch at the man. So, I mean, she holds her own just fine. So, but I always felt this scene is one of the best in the film, not because of the nudity in itself. That's just whatever it is. I mean, if you're a teenager, I'm sure it's your favorite scene. But when you actually analyze the scene, it is brilliant. And I've always been frustrated with the fact that it gets brought up as an example of bad fan service, because this is, if you're going to do fan service, which, again, with fandom, there is a portion of the audience you have to play to. This is the way to do it. Give it meaning, give it levity, and, have some sort of message behind it, cinematically or in the script, whatever it is. This is the way to do it. So I've always been a little bit frustrated with this being brought up as bad, because this is not bad fan service.
It's interesting you say that, because everyone I knew growing up, I always loved this sequence, not just because of the nudity, but it was just down to the brutal fight and how it's choreographed and animated.
Yeah.
And also with the rock music thrown over the top of it really adds an extra level of intensity.
In the English dub, yeah.
Yeah, and you got the blood as well, where she's like, because Vega, in terms of like. Like a sort of deadly weapon. In animation, you can get away with showing the blood, where I think in a live action sense it would have, thrown the rating up even higher. But But also, it's great that Vega's right. I was always kind of, was always kind of a slim character, but again, he's buffed up as well. But I love how they really get across how egocentric he is.
Vain
he's
he
obsessed
is.
with his look, and
Yeah,
how vain he is. Yeah,
it's funny because as Chun Li has been naked, I mean Vega is the one who really gets stripped for all he is, because all you have to do is hurt him without his mask on, and he loses control. So it's kind of turns the table on it. Again, it's just brilliant script writing, which when talking about fan service, this is not the scene to bring up. That's my rant for the day. But I always felt frustrated. I've always wanted to do. I remember when this was re-released, there was some talks of me coming in to do a commentary, and I forget why this didn't happen. But now that it is, I can finally kind of talk about the fact that I think this scene is wonderfully scripted and storyboarded, because the cinematography on this film, and especially this scene then, is really well done.
That's incredible. I mean, you talk about the sort of fandom. It's been interesting. Sort of, I've been going through all the different sort of groups and websites dedicated to Street Fighter, and you get stuff that was kind of really informative, kind of fans of the game, but also you get that side of things where a lot of fan art and cosplaying, and it's the fan art's a bit extreme. I've come across where it's all a bit. with Chun Li with the biggest bum on the planet,
her legs, yeah.
Yeah, it's so unrealistic. I'm just like, okay, guys, this is a bit too much.
Even in the games, I mean, to each of their own. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but they do exaggerate the muscular structure of her thighs, and it's very much part of her. In this film, not so much, but as the series would go on, her legs would be very much thickened up, which good. Stay healthy and eat.
Would you say sort of the regional designs of these characters were somewhat sort of normal, sort of proportioned, and as we saw the series go on, they'd become more sort of just eccentric with their look and really sort of unrealistic, where come Street Fighter 5 and even 4 had it, where everything's far more cartoony and sort of drifted away a little bit from the sort of somewhat realistic design
because
Akiman would have used.
Street Fighter 1 never talked about original fairly realistic character designs and proportions. Street Fighter 2 to a certain extent. I mean, of course they're hyper masculine and whatnot. Like there's all muscles because it's the 90s, but proportion wise, still fairly normal. And then by 0 and then 4 especially had the small heads and huge bodies syndrome, and then 5 kind of somewhere in the middle. So I mean, yeah,
they've all got ginormous feet, haven't they? Massive feet and hands.
Yes, that was that was definitely also a signature of it. So
they went from a size 9 to like a size 44.
They grew up. They grew up all the time. So isn't it like your ears and nose keep growing throughout life? It's just for them it's the hands and feet.
I love this little bit here. You see the Capcom logo on it.
On a truck.
On the old lorry going past, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier, by the way, that the director was changed, and we should probably talk a little bit about this, because, the production of this film was troubled in the beginning, and I think it kind of came out of that competitive nature between SNK and Capcom, that these were announced at the same time, would come out at the same time, and kind of everything got kind of set up due to this. But the actual director of the film as it came out is what's his name, Sugi Gisaburo, and who is a legend in the industry, and was kind of part of the birth of anime, because he worked on like Tetsuo and Adam, like Astro Boy in the West. I'm not really sure what they look like.
I think it was Atom Boy. I can't remember.
Astro Boy.
I can't remember the name.
And then
Astro Boy,
Lupin and other things like this. But he wasn't the original director that was announced. That was actually Ikeda Masashi. And Ikeda Masashi still did go out to work with Capcom, but he did a lot of stuff. He did some of the pivotal episodes of Gundam Wing, which was huge. And he did do Darkstalkers from Capcom after this. And I've actually read some production notes and some articles in Japan regarding what made this change happen. And there's some conflicting reports. There's some just stating straight up health and schedule just didn't work out, so he had to be replaced. There was another one where I read from one of the producers of the film claimed that Ikeda-san ran away. He ran from the production, quite literally, and then didn't show up again, so he had to be replaced. Whereas my theory on it lies somewhere in the middle. I think Ikeda wasn't experienced enough to do a feature film animation like this was going to be. And then Capcom, thanks to Imai, who was producer, who had connection to Toei, he had kind of penciled in Sugi due to his longevity in the industry, and just kind of like, told him that, like, hey, this is the biggest property in the world right now, and you should do it and kind of rekindle your career with this. So he accepted on the condition that he could rewrite the script, I believe. So he has a script credit as well alongside Imai, because I guess Imai's script was unusable from what I understand. So definitely there were some issues here, but thanks to these changes, Sugi would definitely go on to do more Street Fighter stuff. And the connection to Toei really helped Capcom, because Toei was also the ones that were producing the predecessor of K1's TV show, which then Ishii-san was involved with. So he came on as a choreographer. And then, of course, the Prestige, because Obari, as I mentioned earlier, had done Fatal Fury and would eventually go on to do Go Kaisa for SNK, an actual video game that also got an anime. And but Obari was so brash and just like he could do anything because he had the charisma and he had the kind of self-assurance. Ikeda probably wasn't that kind of person, and so I think Capcom kind of stepped in and was like, hey, we probably need someone to ground the production as well as the film and make it different. And I think that's probably why Sugi-san stepped in as the director.
Also, he went on to do the Alpha animated show, didn't he? Or animated feature.
Not Alpha. He did the one that's called Street Fighter 2 V, which is...
that was it, yeah.
Well, he did more than that, actually, because...
I know he wanted to do a sequel to this, but I don't...
there was plans. I'm not sure why it didn't happen. The movie strongly hints at it, but Sugi-san, right after this, or during the production of this, also did an educational animation called Return to Fujiwara.
Oh, yeah, that's...
which
you showed me that not long ago.
Yeah, I have the DVD of that. It was only broadcasted on television, and it's educational. It's
so weird.
It's very strange, and it actually reuses animation cells from this with new backgrounds, and as well as some new animation. And I think this was due to the fact that, from what I read from Sugi's interviews, he came from a different era where just like, it was a morally upstanding hero, and there was always a message behind it. So I think he wanted to kind of draw Street Fighter back to his sensibilities where people learned something. So he got permission from Capcom to make this, and not many people have seen that anime. And then after that, he wanted to do a sequel, but I think this got turned into what we know as Street Fighter 2 V, which was that television series, which is an episodic series that changes a lot of the mythology around. But again, episodic nature of the show has Ryu and Ken and the others kind of learning and growing. So it goes back to more of the standardized animation trope that he was familiar with. So I think he had an idea of what Street Fighter could be and took it in that direction, and that might be why that we didn't get a straight-up sequel, was that there was probably a little bit too many hands at play, and was like, Sugi...
Yeah, because when I saw that, I wasn't quite happy with the direction they went with that, and I think that's probably why Capcom were like, this is it's not working, in terms of like sticking to what they were, I suppose the fans were familiar with. And a shift. I love this moment here because we are going to see the sort of transition of Ken be turned into evil Ken, which you could unlock him, couldn't you, in the Ultra Street Fighter edition on the Switch, wasn't it? Had he popped up in the crossovers, or was he a DLC character at some point? Because I can't.
He was in SNK versus Capcom, not Capcom versus SNK, but SNK versus Capcom. There's Violent Ken, which is
that's right, yeah.
Which is kind of based on this, and here you see, by the way, the Hadouken again, but we don't see it. We only see it from perspectives, right? So, but then we see the effects on the actual character who threw it. So now we know how strong it is.
Blows your top
but
off.
Defeated the same character that threw it. So it's, again, a pretty cool way of introducing these elements, and also showing just how dangerous Bison is, because even the finishing attack from the beginning of the film, now in the middle of the film, has no effect on him. So it's like, okay, so how do you defeat this guy? So again, it's just a great way to introduce how dangerous he is. Without he stood still, he didn't do anything.
Oh yeah.
So
because in the game, he's sort of abilities are just kind of a scissor kick and a jumps on your head or like a psycho crusher.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
He's showing stuff that is kind of beyond what we've seen with him. It's all like messing with your mind and sort of torturing you that way.
Yeah, the psychological aspect of this film. We also see a bit of Bison. Again, I think that has to do with translating the supernatural to cinematic language. In this sense, is like in order to not get people to just get thrown out of this film, and like, oh, well, like now they can do this now, that kind of stuff. A lot of it gets translated to psychological. So, and it's a great way of doing it, and really, it's pretty bold, because I think most producers and Capcom themselves, I would think that they would look at this and be like, they have to do their moves, like, you have to show it, because that's all you see in the game. You do a fireball every half second in that game. But here it's like, no, we keep that restrained. And actually, Sugi's first message to Capcom when they talked, or first kind of thing he said to Capcom's representatives was, whatever you're expecting, you're not going to get it, because I'm not going to make the movie you expect. And they were very happy about that answer, because they were like, well, that will probably mean we get a good film, because we're not sure what we want. So Capcom, at that time at least, were honest enough to say that you know better than us, so we're going to trust you. And they gave him pretty carte blanche to do.
They're willing to take a risk, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
The live action, it does take a lot of risks as well. It's just that I think there was more the sense that the direct communication didn't happen the same way. That's such a big thing, right? Especially in Japan, is that if you don't have direct communication with those who own the IP, you're gonna struggle. And I think this also really got to learn that the hard way, is that suddenly you get these notes, literal like post-it notes with messages saying like, you have to do this and do that on like second to last day of production. And that's not good. But probably from Capcom's side, that was communicated ahead of time, and then through all the steps that Japanese bureaucracy has, it got on De Souza's post-it note several days later. So it's a bit of a shame here that like Chun Li gets taken out. I mean, we did see her get to fight, but it's a bit of a shame that like even in her stead, the Guile doesn't really get to show off his fighting style too much. So
well, see, it's also interesting that they've created a relationship between Chun Li and Guile, sort of a strong friendship to a certain degree, but
because they play up that in the games.
What I always with the artwork, it was very much the early stages of the artwork. It was kind of Ryu and Chun Li, and I didn't really see much of the sort of the Guile and Chun Li connection, where the anime kind of pushed on that. When also in the film there is this kind of, they play on that as well with Chun Li and Guile. There's some sort of connection there with Cammy and Guile, but it's kind of more the sort of respect.
Yeah, there's nothing romantic necessarily about any of these characters, and Ken has his wife. Ryu, I think, is kept pretty much a loner, and then especially in the subsequent animes that came with Street Fighter 4 and such, Guile and Chun Li are shown to be kind of very close friends, but nothing more than that. In the US space though, the Malibu comics, if you remember those, they made the Chun Li and Ryu a couple, like straight up a couple. So I guess there was much more.
Well, they took many liberties, didn't they?
Yes, many, and
with the IP.
But there also always had to be some romance there, I guess. I suppose. This is kind of this scene here kind of reminds me of the live action where, Blanca gets fed all these images to become violent.
That's right.
It's the same deal. I think this is another mandate from Capcom, was kind of they need this kind of scene for whatever reason. And maybe it was something Capcom just felt strongly about communicating for a film rather than a game. But the likeness between these scenarios always made me think that this must have been an idea from Capcom's side, because it's basically the exact same, right?
It is, yeah. It's their way of sort of visualizing a way in which to change someone from good,
corrupting them
to bad. Yeah, corrupting them, exactly. So you can see there, Ken has no penis.
Yeah, so nudity again.
Not drawn that in.
I mean,
you should give him some shorts, you know.
Well, it's equality. I mean, we saw Chun Li naked earlier, so only fair to see a Ken.
He's literally like a Ken doll, isn't he? Yep. It's all smooth.
Pretty much, literally a Ken doll. So, but yeah, this it's an interesting concept of corrupting the character, because Ryu is the one that kind of takes on that trope from here. In the games, he becomes evil Ryu, which is the corruption of the Hado, the style they uses. But in this film, and then also in SNK versus Capcom, they used the violent Ken. But it's not really used in Capcom's official canon much, violent Ken, I think. I don't think that is part of the canon.
I think with this, though, Ryu is he's played out to be an all-good character. He's a sort of driving force of sort of, of the good with Ken and Ryu. I mean, he seems uncorruptible. Yeah, Ryu does. So
yeah, he's very pure. He's very much modeled after like the Japanese. I shouldn't say stereotype, but
he's a classic hero.
Ideal, yeah.
Put it that way.
In Japanese, like Chanbara and stuff, like the samurai. That's kind of what he's playing, the pure one that doesn't really. And then later on, he becomes that corrupted Hado thing, because that's where the story goes. But yeah, here, because this is, this is a film by filmmakers, produced by filmmakers, and then starring film actors, not voice actors so much. So this doesn't really fall into the pitfalls of standard anime, at least of this era. That's what made this so different, and different from the Fatal Fury movie as well. Was that the pacing and such?
I suppose it kind of made it more appealing to me at that age, where I had seen some anime which didn't quite kind of connect with me. Yeah. Maybe it's down to how it's been dubbed in certain ways, but I think tonally and the sort of how things sort of play out, it felt a little bit strange. But that was the thing with manga. It was to be, especially for the dubbing, was to have more swearing, more kind of violence thrown in to sort of make it like this is 18, this is for older boys to watch. It wasn't for the Disney kind of soft entertainment. It was very much designed to appeal to older teenagers just through the violence.
Yeah, that was a shocking thing for me as a kid. Was this came out when I was about 12, 11, maybe 13. I forget. I forget when the VHS came out here specifically. Here in Europe, but the fact that the English dub had cursing, because I had that tape with, there were two dubs. One was did not have cursing, and then I think the Manga Entertainment one did have the cursing in it.
That's what I was familiar with. Yeah, that was the one I had all the swearing
and I was shocked. I remember. It was just like there's a scene later on where Guile is like, "I'll rip your fucking heart out," or something like that, and I was just like, "Can he say that? Like, he doesn't say that in the game."
Because I got the laserdisc of it, the American laserdisc, and I was like watching it, going, "Oh, it doesn't have the swearing in it." I was like, "What?" So I was annoyed because for years you kind of waited so long to sort of get a decent high definition widescreen version which had the swearing in it and the extra nudity, but it was annoying, because it also, this has been re-released so many times and we still it hasn't been given like any sort of meaty behind the scenes. I think that's the problem when you're dealing with Japanese animation. There's a lack of behind the scenes stuff they can really pull from.
Yeah, maybe in this. I mean, I know Discotek did the latest one, which is great, because Discotek Media does very good releases, and I think that has like storyboards and such. At least I don't have that version, but as you mentioned, By the way, I just want to mention that scene kind of gave Sagat some characterization that the games would also take on, the kind of humanization of Sagat, being that he cares about the martial arts aspect of this tournament and fighting, and Bison just basically
not interested.
Yeah, just how trivial is that? But yeah, the releases. It was only recently that we got good transfers, because this movie was distributed and given out by basically everyone, and they were really bad releases for the most part. Pan and scan, different cuts, cutting out violence, nudity, and it was just hard to find. Even the uncut, uncensored release in the US, the DVD, I think, was like double-sided and had a really bad transfer for one of the sides. So it never ever got the treatment that should have. And then eventually on Blu-ray, finally, I think it was the French company called Kaze who got the original negatives and then did the mastering that you see on like Discotheque and the Kaze Blu-rays. So it took a long time. The VHSs too had some issues, and it was even given out with one of the anniversary release of Street Fighter 2 on PlayStation, which was even more cut than the PG releases.
It was just this, you can just select it on the options or something like that. It was just kind of very kind of pixelated, kind of MPEG.
It was
2 or something.
Not
like
good. And they also re-released that version, I think, on their 25th anniversary box, which came with this film, the entire US animated series, which can't wait to do that commentary, by the way. And yeah, and I think some of the anime as well, the series. So that I have that box. It has all the soundtracks and everything. It's quite fantastic. But I forget what animes they actually put in there. So the interplay here between characters reminds me of something. That is we talked a lot about the English dub, but the Japanese dub, we talked about the music. It's kind of restricted, as you mentioned, reserved. And the music was performed, in the Japanese version was performed by Toriyama Yuji, who actually would go on to work with Capcom and Square Enix. A fantastic guitarist, and he did actually an album called Street Fighter 2 with Yuji Toriyama, which had like the original game music performed and the style of this film. It's a very good album. If you can seek it out, you should. But the actual voice acting was done by film actors and actresses, and unfortunately it's kind of like a poltergeist situation, or I guess it's The Exorcist. That's kind of famously everyone had some bad turnout in their careers after that film, right? And The Curse. And this movie in Japan had a bit of a curse, because the voice of Ryu was Shimizu Kochiro, I think his name was. And he was super famous at this time. He had done like Bebop High School, he had been a pop singer, and was on TV all the time. He did this film, and then after that he took a left turn to V Cinema, which is basically softcore films in Japan. Which, I mean, video cinema can be many things, and it should be noted that doing adult features in Japan, soft or hardcore, doesn't necessarily relegate you out of mainstream. You can be pretty celebrated still, because it doesn't have that taboo. But that's kind of where he ended up. And then, unfortunately, when I was in Japan many years ago, I remember he popping up on TV, and they mentioned that he had left the industry and was suffering from effects of alcoholism and was in rehabilitation. So he was on TV talking about rehab. So I hope he's doing better today. I know he's still alive. But that was the voice of Ryu. And then the voice of Ken is even more interesting, because that was Kenji Haga, and he was super up and coming at this time, because he was part of Disney Japan's crew, and he had done I think he did Aladdin. I think he was the voice of Aladdin in Japan, and even did the singing. So he was like huge in the acting space. He had also been on TV all the time, and then in the mid 2000s he was arrested for ties to Yakuza. So he's also out of it. So
God.
But, yeah, not too.
The curse of Street Fighter.
Yeah, so I think it was like in mid 2000s that he went away. By the way, Balrog here has a lazy eye. I always wondered if that's.
Yes, it's slightly boss-eyed, isn't he? I think that's kind of the animation, maybe. Yeah, it's. I do like it though when they sort of roll off the cliff and just like, oh shit!
Yeah, it's very funny. It's funny in the U.S. dub and the Japanese dub.
It
they
is,
do
yeah.
scream. Because the Japanese dub doesn't really have much humor. The humor is kind of out of it. Whereas it's in the U.S., comedic timing is very well done here. And you finally get to see Balrog fighting as well. You haven't really seen him. He took his shirt off without using his hands earlier. So I guess that was impressive.
Yeah, he did. Just expanded his chest,
Oh man, here's Guile doing like a few things, but ultimately just, shortchanged, man.
Yeah, shortchanged. Yeah, but I adore the sonic boom. I think it's just down to the fact that it's the way the voice actor delivers it and the damage it causes. But.
Yeah, I think there you get the flash kick and then the sonic boom, and the sonic boom is cool because it takes out that thought, which I guess was going to fall down anyway based on how it was built. But I think Guile's role in the film, if he came back at the end when like Ryu and Ken, are basically at their limits, and then he came back to kind of save them or something, maybe that could have kind of saved him a little bit in terms of his character rendition.
If you got like a few hits on Bison near the end, because on there because Ryu holds Bison's legs, while Ken does a hurricane kick, and maybe Guile could have come in did a back fist sort of move or something. But yeah, it's a shame, really.
Yeah, because now we just see him here and essentially dead out of the film. He is not dead, but that's where he's at, unfortunately.
One attack sort of took him down, and it's the
from.
I suppose he was kind of unprepared to take on Bison.
From the perspective of the characters, he has the most reason to take out Bison because his best friend was. I guess Chun Li as well, but she's not here. But he really should have had the last blow, just based on the fact that he's taking revenge for Charlie Nash. So you just don't get that. And speaking of voice actors, Honda is done by Gori Daisuke, who is probably the most prolific voice actor of all time in Japan. He was in everything, and again, he passed away from suicide years ago. So just the curse of this film, I guess, kept striking.
Oh, so unfortunate, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very sad. Most of the main actors here just aren't, because they do a fantastic. I mean, their voices, especially in the game sense, because the original voices in Street Fighter 2 were just from Capcom sound staff, so they are just generic, kind of like it sounds like an old man, Sonic Boom. Like it doesn't sound like much. Whereas from this point on, they actually did employ voice actors in Zero, and obviously in the modern Street Fighters they speak a lot more. But the characterizations in this film were very important to how they would take the characters onwards. And it's sad that it couldn't have been them, or just that it can't be celebrated for this, because this fantastic performances, and despite the issues I mentioned with pacing and characters popping up and whatnot, it is a fantastic animated feature. You can't take that away from it.
Oh, no. I think for me as a fan of Street Fighter, this kind of spoke to me really, far more than the live action film, which I I'm always is a major guilty pleasure to me. But this kind of really fully expanded their sort of the mythology of these characters, where it was, in the case of Mortal Kombat, you had this kind of story there. It was very much kind of aping Enter the Dragon, but
it's completely aping up Enter the Dragon. It's 1 by 1 almost.
but as we saw over the years, they really kind of expanded Mortal Kombat quite extensively. Where Street Fighter always, I don't know, we had the information about the characters from like just little bits of information here and there, but this kind of fully expanded things. It wasn't that deep, but it was enough for me to be like, okay, this is how Street Fighter, how it should be in terms of its story. But you actually, one thing you'd mentioned, we talked about the music earlier, and you'd said before recording that Alpha Layla, the sort of Capcom's in-house sort of music team, had written some parts of the music for this, and the US kind of, the Western dub, they had to take some inspiration from it, didn't they?
Yeah, so Alpha Layla was the in-house band for Capcom, which was comprised by some live stage musicians and some composers, and did live shows in Japan. So this was the era where like Sega Sound Team and Suntara and all these people were doing live concerts with game music.
Yeah.
So it's kind of part of this movement. And they did do some tracks for this. They're credited on a few. And from what I understand, some of the music that was done by Lerios and DeAndrea still had to take into account these new tracks because they were apparently, as they were done by Alf Laila and written by them, it was kind of part of the soundtrack. Just this is the sound that needs to be in the film, and then anything else could be replaced because there are some vocal tracks that were very popular, by the way. The music from the film, the actual theme song, I think it was one of the highest selling 8cm CDs of this year when it released in Japan. So that song still plays in Japan on radio. I actually, when I was eating at Sukiya, I think it was, or something, I heard like a MIDI rendition of it because they can't play it due to rights, so they use MIDI likeness soundtracks at those eateries. And I heard that, and I was telling my boss, like, that's the theme song to like Street Fighter movie, and he's like, yep. So it's still very popular.
Amazing.
Probably more popular than the film.
When I got the album, though, I was just like, I didn't particularly like it. I liked, as I was saying before we started recording, was the acoustic guitar kind of melody they used. They deploy at the end.
Yes,
when
Farewell,
walking down the street.
Ryu and Ken.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that.
Because the movie soundtrack was released in 2 parts, I think, on CD. If I remember it was correctly, because I think I do have both, but I just haven't put them in a CD player in 10 years. But it was released in 2 parts with both, vocal tracks and the background music, as well as some music from the actual video game, which is kind of confusing because that is one thing about the music in the film for either the US dub or the Japanese dub, is that they do not use any of the stage music so much. There may be some cues that I've forgotten that are similar, but
that's the thing that like Graham Revell had sort of said that he'd took some inspiration from the video game for his score, but I can't for the life of me think where he'd deployed it.
No,
it's D'Souza said they wanted to just go with something different, and it's the case with this as well. They had not really deployed any of that, which is strange in a way because Street Fighter 2, each of the characters have such a distinctive theme, and it's the themes are so memorable, and it seems odd to somewhat move away from that, or maybe not hint at it. And it's the themes are just as recognisable as sort of John Williams sort of stuff to a certain generation.
So it's a good comparison with John Williams and like Star Wars, Indiana Jones, like these themes. At the same time, though, video game music is composed for a different medium, and there is something to be said that it almost takes kind of life of its own and becomes distracting. That's always what I heard when people have produced any of these kinds of things and kind of opted not to use something where you would think, why wouldn't you? Castlevania got a anime on Netflix recently, which is quite great. But obviously the most popular thing about Castlevania, I would say, is the music. And the producers of that acknowledged it, and they did use some of it in the 2nd season, I think. But it's just kind of like, if you play that music, you're not paying attention to what's going on screen. It's just that simple. It becomes distracting. So when you're doing things, we as game fans and familiar with this would obviously keep saying that, like, oh, why aren't you using this? Why aren't you using that? But at the same time, we have to recognize that it might have become distracting. That's, kind of the worst scenario for a film, is that you get taken out of it. That's never good.
It's a difficult choice of how to deploy sort of homage to something, and playing on nostalgia. Where at this point it wasn't nostalgia because it was still like
brand new.
Everything was still Street, brand new. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean it's a creative choice, and it's not a major problem. I wasn't upset at the time or annoyed, but it was just surprising that they made that decision. But what we got though with the alternative dub for the English market was just incredible. So
yeah, too bad they never released that, man. There was there was so much talks.
One day it will happen.
Well, I don't know, because there was in the mid 2000s. I think it was DeAndrea that was on like Soundtrack Central or one of these like movie soundtrack forums back in the day, and they kept talking about the fact that they want to remaster the soundtrack and release it, and then that they had so much unused materials. So it's like, oh, we have as much unused as we did used, and it's really good. So I remember there was lots of talks from fans just like, where is the soundtrack? I really want to hear it. And it's never happened. It's unfortunately gone the ways of Guyver Dark Hero, because the composer of that was on the same forum saying the same thing, and we never got the soundtrack to that either. So
well, it took over 30 years for the score to Ghostbusters 2 to come out. So
that's true.
I wouldn't be too disappointed. I'm sure it will eventually come out, but I think we discussed this a couple of weeks ago, but I think there's probably only about 30 minutes worth of actual score that's in it. I would say the stuff that's been left on the cutting room floor is probably maybe equal to that, or maybe more. So because I had to sort of deploy a lot of these kind of licensed songs which kind of take up the space on the soundtrack.
Good amount of space actually. So
yeah.
This, by the way, is the inspiration. We were talking about dramatic battle at the beginning, because that uses the stage with the background with the grass. But this is, the actual dramatic battle where Ryu and Ken takes on Bison
love
together.
this in playing. I love playing this on Street Fighter Alpha.
The scene is amazing, but the actual mode in Street Fighter Zero is very duct taped together, and it would take them a while to kind of get that down. But I do remember that like it's quite unbalanced of a Street Fighter mode, the dramatic battle.
I played it for hours with my friend. All you had to do was just spam Bison by just both doing hurricane kicks. One do a super hurricane kick, and the other one players Ken do the hurricane kick. The combo count was so high, it's ridiculous.
This is very the choreography here is very Hong Kong action at times, with all these blocking, and
it's like they've done a lot of close-ups. They've decided to do that. They haven't cut to any sort of. It chose to sort of animate it with wides, but get Bison's kind of slide here, which is quite cool.
It's really cool because again, it's like we're starting to introduce here now, like more of the supernatural, obviously with Bison, but it's still.
I love the kick and punch to his gut.
Yeah,
it's great. It's proper meaty.
Like the impact is so important to that, because if you just show that at a wide angle with like no effect to it, right, no impact, it would have just been whatever. Like the elbow to the back, for example, you just saw there. It's so painful looking because the entire the scene stops and just kind of shakes. So you get this like the movie stops literally because his back is basically broken. So it's so cool to see how this movie is choreographed like a real, action film, like a Hong Kong action and what have you, rather than just going straight to these projectiles and shoryukens all the time. Because it wouldn't have been as visually interesting, as amazing as that sounds, because you would think that all these fantastical elements would be way more, anime, much more interesting to watch in a cartoon. You're making a cartoon, you don't have to be restricted by reality. But it's the fact that when you make animation and do ground it in reality, it becomes much more interesting to watch, because you're combining
definitely.
elements together.
When you're seeing those impacts of Ryu punching Bison in the gut and in the face, it's very impactful, and it kind of works, and it's sort of and you kind of forget to some degree you're watching an animated movie.
This the post-victory stance from the game, though. I guess he gives a thumbs up there, Ken, but he should have given the peace sign to be
he should have done, shouldn't he?
True to the game. I'm not sure why he didn't. I guess oversight. So we talked about stages earlier, and here, of course, you have that face. I think it's a Buddha or something like this. And I mean, that's of course a nod to the one you see in Sagat's stage. So they did get some inspiration. You had also the Air Force earlier of Guile, so there are nods to it, but not as many as maybe you would expect.
This is also, they didn't show you. I mean, because there's that great artwork, that inspired D'Souza to sort of go with the sort of Bison having this big, underground layer, and he had all these rockets and so forth, and that was kind of what we see with the animated movie. But you see the interior and you sort of kind of the exterior, but it's kind of hidden behind it. Also, you don't see the sort of the multiple layers to a certain degree that he's got this massive military army kind of that he could deploy at some point to take over the world. But you see kind of there's elements of it there, but it's not fully expanded upon. It's kind of it's maybe hints at something that in the sequel they would kind of utilize. But
yeah, I think there was definitely nods here to a sequel. By the way, its license plate is Cap 2088. I'm not sure what the 2088 stands for, but a little nod there to Capcom. There was also the truck earlier. But yeah, there definitely was talks of a sequel. I think I don't know if it was ever publicly announced. I do recall some video game magazines in the West saying that it was going to come out eventually. But I think again they might have actually looked at the Street Fighter V anime previews and say like, oh, this is the follow up, or even the Return to Fuji era might have been the one that they saw. But no production was started on an actual sequel because Sugi was definitely much more into doing episodic television with this and have his own take on these characters. I think he really wanted to flesh them out and give them more meaning and moral upstanding. I've always read him as someone that kind of enjoyed kind of upholding good morals and values. And not that these characters are like bad necessarily overall, but they are somewhat empty beyond their main priority here, which basically is take out Bison for the most part in the film. Is either help to take out Bison or take out Bison.
Well, it's the big challenge of taking just these video game characters with very little background with their history of these characters or story there, and trying to create something out of it that will be entertaining for 90 minutes or more. It's very tough, and I think they did a honourable job. I think they did everyone I knew who loved Street Fighter at the time and adored it. So it was like, I've seen this animated movie so many times. Maybe less in my kind of in my 20s, my late 20s, early 30s. I suppose down to the fact that it wasn't available. You know what I mean? Like
right.
In high definition for so long, that kind of you somewhat forget about it. And I often associate this film with its music. So that was, and I'd obviously kind of moved on from my sort of musical taste of like Korn and grunge. I was more into film scores and kind of 80s music like Aha and Nick Kershaw, which has kind of gone backwards in time. But it was because that stuff I'd kind of moved away from, and so you often forget about it. And then as I've returned to it over the years, and now making this documentary, I sort of come to sort of relive sort of my nostalgia for it and my appreciation for it, and it still works. I don't think it, as you say, its story is kind of a bit thin, and I think for showing it to people that aren't familiar with Street Fighter, they'd probably be a bit sort of underwhelmed by it in some cases,
especially the story. I think they would just kind of be like,
yeah,
the action I think they would definitely get into, but then the story would just kind of be like, well, who's this, why do these people care about him? And it's like, oh, okay, like you would have to constantly sit there and kind of fill in the gaps that the movie still leaves.
Yes.
So the credit sequence here, by the way, as depending on what cut you're watching, it would be very different. Because the Japanese ending credits has this very long sequence of Ryu walking down the highway, and it's quiet. You basically have a little bit of music coming in, but again, it's kind of keeping with the theme of Ryu. Be like you're basically thinking for Ryu, like you're being introspective about it. Whereas in I think the US cut had kind of regular credits with Korn, I think. So,
well, Korn kicks in a minute where this bit ends with this amazing guitar riff, and suddenly just like, "Are you ready?"
Yeah.
It kicks in, and I was like, when I was 13, whatever, when I saw this, I was just like, "Oh my god, this is the best thing ever!" And then you think I went on like MTV or The Box, I think it was The Box on cable, and then Korn was on it, and you had to sort of phone in to get the song you want, and that was when I with regards to Street Fighter, it was like Straight to My Feet. That was on The Box all the time.
Man, that was such a good song too.
Yeah.
Should've
So
been this
catchy,
film.
so cheesy. But yeah, I mean, as as so final thoughts, Audie. I mean, as I said, I think this still works. It's a great anime, and it fits so well into the sort of Street Fighter history and expanding upon its sort of mythology to sort of inspire everything else.
I mean, this was so important to Street Fighter because it took Street Fighter 2 another level, as it should and wanted to. And prior to this, all video game adaptations were OVAs, as I mentioned. So low budget. I think Mario actually did have a theatrical animation in '86, Rescue of Princess Peach, which has never been released in the West. But other than that, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest and all this just got like VHS tapes with very long production times between them, showing up to tie in with their releases. Whereas this was a actual feature-length film that was animated. It was basically, as I mentioned earlier, their kind of Disney movie based on their characters and their universe. And I think Capcom really wanted to make use of that universe because they did go on to make Darkstalkers, the anime, and other animes based on their properties. So this was a huge success to them, and huge success to anime. And I think this is the introduction for a lot of people to anime, thanks to the connection to the game.
I think so. Yeah. Because I had a couple of friends who didn't really. They were probably familiar with things like Akira, and perhaps Fist of the North Star, but they hadn't really kind of watched it because some of my friends, had parents who didn't let them watch kind of 18 rated kind of features. So when I got to see Street Fighter, which was a 15, they could sort of get away with it, and that was like, wow, that was their introduction. Also, we had like animated cartoons from Japan, all animated by the Japanese. So you had that sort of somewhat introduction there, but on this scale of quality of animation, and of it not being sort of this sort of stereotypical kind of Disney way of sort of you kind of know structurally what it's going to be, like plot wise. With this was a lot different, and it sort of plays on the sort of the big muscly action heroes of the 80s, all the characters all being super buff, but have all got like special moves, and it felt like the video game had somewhat come to life, and that's the next extension of it. From you going from a video game then to animation, there's a far better sort of, I think, an easier sort of transition, where going from a video game 2D sprites to live action with actors and so forth is such a big challenge, and it can't, it's and I always understood D'Souza's kind of difficulty with that, where these guys had somewhat less of a challenge in terms of that sort of easy transition, and I think they did it extremely well.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Well, Audie, I think you had mentioned earlier about sort of discussing the sort of the US sort of TV show, but I think it would be fun though, because I know you've done a commentary on it already, but it would be good to talk to you again about the Van Damme movie at some point.
I would do 50 more commentaries on that film, my friend. So just as long as we get to do the US animated show, at least the first episode.
First episode, it'd be a sort of bonus commentary extra, I think. With the cause that is a somewhat a continuation of the film, isn't it? I recall.
Yes, it's based on the film,
and it has a terrible intro. Which, most cartoons have a great intro, like Thundercats and Visionaries, but this, no,
not so much.
Not at all.
Not so much.
No. Well, everyone, that's the end of the commentary. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining me, Audie, and we'll be back with some more very soon. Take care and goodbye.
Bye-bye.